All right, good morning, Discovery. This is your global 6K team. My name is Chris Palo, and this is Christine Smith. How many of you enjoy running, walking, hiking, going to the park, and being active? Anyone in here? I know I do, and honestly, running has become a little bit obsessive, especially over the last 15 years. So much so that I've got a routine. I only run in one type of shoe, and I basically just upgrade that shoe to the new model each year. There's only certain type of shorts that I can run in, and there's a pre-run routine and a post-run routine, which often includes chocolate milk. We do these things for leisure, and we do these things for sport, but none of us does these activities because our life depends on it. Right now, in developing countries, women and children, on average, are traveling 6 kilometers round trip just to get water, and in many cases, it's not even clean water. Did you know that in these countries, diarrhea is still a top 5 cause of death? They don't get to take days off because it's too hot, they're tired, or maybe it's raining. They don't get to go out there and travel with their Asics or their specially designed shorts, and they're definitely not getting chocolate milk afterwards. We, however, have an opportunity to do something about it. And so what we're asking is that you partner with us, with our Discovery Global 6K team. We ask that you join us on Saturday, March 21st at North Park, as we take the symbolic 6 kilometers, which is just a little under 4 miles, and we raise awareness and help to work with World Vision to help solving some of these solutions. So we're asking you to go out there and tell your friends and your family and your small groups. You can run, you can walk, you can bring your stroller, you can bring your dog, but we want to basically show up and show out and take these orange shirts and just flood North Park and join not only our community, but those around the globe who do this special event on that day. Now, Christine is going to give you some more specific details on signing up.
Hello. So I just wanted to let you know that it's just really easy to register. You can go to Discovery's website and register just by clicking the link, and it'll take you right to the page. You just fill out your information, and right now we're offering a promotion code for $15 off, or we're not, but World Vision is. So if you can take advantage of that registration fee, it's $50 for adults and $25 to register for children. And it's just a great cause. You don't have to be there specifically on May 21st. If you want to do it virtually, you can do that as well. But by just signing up and being a part of the Discovery team, you'll help us bring awareness and be a part of our community, our church, to support this wonderful cause. If you have any questions, there's a table in the lobby that you're welcome to come and ask any information or questions, and we really hope to see every one of you sign up, and it'll be a fun day if you can make it to North Park on May 21st. We're starting at 8:30, and we're going to warm up, and then at 9 o'clock we'll start the race. Run, walk, it's not really a race, and we hope to see everyone there afterwards for the post party. We'll have some snacks and hopefully live music and just be celebrating. And this is just a great event to bring awareness and much needed water wells to all of the people that don't have it, unfortunately, in this day and age, and we take it for granted so often. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you guys all register and out there on May 21st. Thanks.
Well, that's an awesome opportunity we can partner together with as a church. We invite you to check out that table after the service. Let's go ahead and stand. Whether you're in person or online, we have more than enough reason to praise Jesus and thank him for his wisdom and his power. So go ahead and stand and worship with us.
King, come let us bow at his feet.
provision and his power. Amen. Thanks for worshiping with us. Go ahead and grab a seat.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. Thanks for coming to hang out with us here at Discovery. They did a great job, right? You guys did a fantastic job thanking them. Yeah, awesome, awesome. Well, welcome. My name's Todd. I'm one of the pastors on staff here, and there's a bunch of people here. Super glad you guys are here. Thanks for coming to hang out with us. But there's also a bunch of people online. Will you guys welcome them into the room right now? Woo! Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks so much for hanging out with us here at Discovery. We want to give you a heads up in about a month. There's a big day here. It's a day that we call Easter. Other people call it that as well. It's a really well-known day. April 17th, it's kind of a big deal. It's this day when we get to celebrate the most important thing that's ever happened in the history of the world, the time, reality, the universe. It changed everything, whether or not you believe in Jesus or anything like that. It still is the pivotal moment in history that changes everything. We believe this guy came back from the dead, and we get to celebrate it on that day because we think it also means that we get to come back from the dead as well, and not just in the future, but even now. That he's continually resurrecting things. So we're going to celebrate that coming up April 17th, and we would love for you to be here. If this is your normal service, this 10:30 time slot, we would just encourage you guys, maybe consider possibly going at 9 o'clock, unless you're inviting somebody and you want to sit with them. We definitely, if you're inviting somebody, definitely sit with those people. You guys online, it's going to be 10:30, and we have enough spots for you, so don't worry about that at all. It won't be crowded. We'd love to have you there, or feel free to come in person. If you are inviting somebody, just a heads up, when it's Easter, it's these kinds of holidays, people are a lot more receptive to invitations than you would think. And so there's a lot of studies out there that just basically say most people would say yes if you invited them to church. And so if you know somebody, you have a good relationship with somebody, and you think, man, they could use a little bit more Jesus in their life, just feel free to invite them in some way to that Easter service. It's probably one of those times that they're going to be more likely to come and just see what it's all about, see what we're talking about, because we're talking about something kind of crazy, a guy coming back from the dead, and everybody's like, what are these people talking about? So they might want to be here and come and hang out. So Easter coming up. Would love to see you. We'll also have some overflow back in the public room if you want to kind of experience the service a little bit different. Be open to the idea of maybe hanging out in the public room. It'll be fun. That is that. That song, fantastic song. It's been an earworm. It's been a big deal in our culture for a long time, and for good reason, because I think at some level, all of us want that. We want to rule the world, or at least we want a little bit more power than we have right now, or at the very least, we want to be able to bend the ear of somebody who is in power. We want to be able to make a difference, and sometimes it feels like we know all of the obvious answers. Why don't those people that have all of the power and influence to do that, why don't they understand what we see is so easy, so obvious, and so clearly easy to do? And if you disagree with that, you say you don't want any power, just give me like 10 minutes, and let me find something on social media that says otherwise, because I guarantee there is some criticism, complaint, or position you've taken that says, man, I wish I were in power. I wish I could make a difference in this way. From our earliest ages, as we kept a running list of what we do, what we buy, what we decide, when we had all of our parents' power, and now that some of you are parents, you realize that it's actually the kids that hold all of the power in your house. They at least determine your schedules. We think if I were only in charge, I would do things differently. If I were in my boss's shoes, I wouldn't ride that guy so hard. I'd actually appreciate the people doing all of the work. I'd finally give this department the direction that it deserves. How many hours have we spent criticizing elected officials, presidents after presidents, local representatives, school boards especially that have nothing to do with our school district? Our criticisms oftentimes imply if they just put me there, I'd have all the answers. And then we demand from them change over things that they have almost no control over, things like gas prices. Well, if I were in office, I just don't see why they can't blank. Why don't they just do blank? Isn't it incredible how many of your Facebook friends were suddenly experts in epidemiology, and those same people now know everything you could know about Russian politics? Why don't we just put those guys in power? Let's vote for them and put them in seats of power and see what they do. I just saw a cultural smash hit, Hamilton. How many of you guys have seen that before? What's the central plot of Hamilton? It's resentment over who's in the room where it happens, right? People that want power. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about getting a seat at the table, whether through protests or elections or people leveraging their platforms. We want new people. We want the right people. We want better people in positions of power. A blog post caught my eye a few months ago, kind of about this sort of thing. It's from a guy that's a rapper, but he's much more than that. He's really an intellectual, and he's been a really vocal advocate for change in recent years. His name's Propaganda, and as a black man in America and a committed follower of Jesus and a super smart dude, he's been an interesting voice to listen to, especially as the conversations in America have been trying to figure out what to do about systemic issues. He's been on platforms, he's been on podcasts, he's been even at protests. He's wanted new people at the tables of power, and so much so, he quickly said yes when he had the opportunity himself. He was invited by a friend of his who ran an organization that worked in the most dangerous places in the world to be on the board of directors. And when Propaganda got there, he was so excited to really be able to create real change, to be a part of the big scale things that were happening. He said it was kind of boring at first, but it was an honor to be in that position. Until things got really difficult. They started receiving reports that his friend, the person in charge, was abusing his power. And while they couldn't make anything public, they said they went through an investigation. At the end of the day, they realized they needed to ask him to step down. So Propaganda had to ask his friend to step down out of leadership, somebody he had referenced in multiple songs. And so he put a public post out there to kind of describe the process he went through, wrestling with what he should do in this scenario. And this is what he wrote. He said, "I'd never been on this side of a justice issue, the side where I hold the power of change. I talked about being a change agent my whole life, but now it's gotten real. When I finally got a seat, I didn't actually grasp the weight of what it means to have power. Everybody wants to be the boss until it's time to do the boss things. Everyone wants a seat at the table until they become aware that the table is full of an impossible Rubik's Cubes, that even if you get it right, you're still wrong, that all decisions come with a body count. Are you sure you want that seat? Are you even ready for it? Especially this time of year, my yard is full of chipmunks and rabbits, and they make my dog Mowgli go crazy. And he darts out the door after them. He barks wildly at them. And Sam and I oftentimes wonder out loud, what would he do if he actually got one of those? Is he going to play with it because he's such a playful dude? Or is he going to try to eat it? The instincts are going to kick in, and this is his meal now. When we finally get a seat at the table, will we know what we are going to do with it? Are we too enthralled with the chase to even think about what's next? Are we too busy resenting the people that have power to become the kinds of people who could wield it any better? In a room like this, in an area like this, I know many of you have already confronted this reality. You've been given a seat, and like Propaganda, you've twisted that Rubik's Cube maybe one too many times. You've made the hard calls. You've been criticized, even though you've done your best to do the absolute right thing. You've noticed that most decisions aren't black and white. Most of them are like looking at a color swatch with various shades of gray. So this week's about drive. It's about power, how we stay hungry, how we devour. Or at least that's what Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson says. Kay didn't feel comfortable covering that song. I don't know why. But we've been following along in this book called Core52. It's a 52-week primer on biblical themes. If you don't have one of those books, if you have no idea what that is, we would love to give you one for free. Just go out to start here, or just go to the bookshelf that's out there to the left and grab one off the shelf. It's a great way for people to stay connected to God and to explore some really in-depth, important biblical themes. It's 5 days of practices, kind of trying to stay in tune with God throughout your week. And so we'd love for you to jump in there. This is week 7. This is the 7th chapter. And if you're new to this, you haven't started at all, or you've fallen behind, don't worry about catching up. Just start this week, week 7. This is kind of the beginning of it right now. And so we're excited to kind of push through from there. This chapter, and this week, this morning, we're taking a look at a transition point in Israel's history in which God reluctantly promoted a man named Saul to the head of the table, the first ever human king of Israel. And through an overview of his story, I hope we can learn to understand some really important foundational truths about power, the nature of power, so that when we get it, not if we get it, but when we get it, we'll have a better idea about what to do with it, because power's coming your way at some point. So once you get it, how are you going to respond? So if you want to follow along, we'll be in the Bible. We'll be in 1 Samuel chapter 8 through 16. I know a lot of chapters, so we'll kind of be hitting a few things here and there. The memory verse for this week, which is like kind of the core verse for this whole thing, is also the core verse for this message. It's a classic. It's central to everything we're going to talk about. It comes from when God's prophet Samuel, he's trying to pick the second king of Israel. So spoiler alert, the first king, Saul, doesn't work out so well. And they have to go pick a second one. And Samuel's standing there in front of a few different guys, 3 different guys, and they're all brothers. And he's like, all of these guys look pretty good to me. What do you think, God? Do you think that this guy or this guy or this guy should be the next king? And God says, no, none of these guys. I've got somebody else in mind. But he says specifically this: do not consider his appearance or the other people's appearances or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. We don't need studies to prove this, but they're out there. Good-looking people get more interviews, they get more promotions, they get bigger paychecks, they even get shorter prison sentences. Our outward appearance is currency in our human economy. We give ridiculous amounts of cultural power to beautiful people. We call them celebrities because they embody everything that we celebrate: beauty, good looks. In the show 30 Rock, they use John Hamm to make this point that handsome people get whatever they want. They call it that they kind of like live in a bubble. So he becomes all-pro tennis in college, even though he could never return a serve. He was a medical doctor who couldn't do the Heimlich. He even proudly cooks seafood in Gatorade because some woman at the Food Network told him he could because she liked him. Everyone gives him a pass because he's just so hot. But our human obsession with appearances goes well beyond how you fill out your muscle shirt or those yoga pants. We judge people by how likely their house is to be featured on HGTV, or how many digits we think might be on their paycheck, or how well they filter their lives on social media, or even simply the confidence or humor they project when they walk into a room. We think these superficial qualities are the signs that these people have power already or should be given power. And so we nominate them or promote them or we vote for them. Our first impression is oftentimes to love all of the wrong things about each other, but God is not distracted like we are. Appearances aren't bad. Sometimes they really are the result of a life well lived. Sometimes their outsides really do match the insides, but God always values something else much more than any of our appearances. In our culture, when we talk about the heart, it's kind of the metaphorical center of our emotions. But throughout history, the history of Jewish thought, it was slightly different. Emotions were in your bowels because, when you get butterflies in your stomach, you have gut reactions. When you hear bad news, your stomach churns. But before they knew that what brains were, your heart was the center of your mind. It was your will, your conscience, your choices, and even your desires, rooted all in your heart. A few chapters earlier, there's a related passage that describes more specifically what God is looking for. This might sound familiar. It says, the Lord seeks out people who are after his own heart. What does that mean? It means your heart's like a compass. It wants to be led. It will point towards the strongest magnetic force. God's pull is strong if you're close enough, but other magnetic forces can easily get in the way and pull that compass in a lot of different directions. This passage describes someone who's close enough, who's calibrated to be pulled in God's direction. For God, nothing is more powerful than a heart aligned with his. Do they think like him? Do they hope like him? Do their moral principles line up with his? Are they pointing in the same direction with the same purpose? Do they love the same things that God loves? Or are other magnetic forces leading them on a wild goose chase in life? So as Israel, Saul, and God begin to play power games, these themes are at the center of this story. Before Israel had a king, they were a loose confederation of 12 tribes for a few hundred years, only unified when they absolutely needed to be. In those moments of danger and desperation and fear, God would raise up a leader out of obscurity, and they never knew when or where, and were probably constantly concerned that it wouldn't happen in time that this guy would show up and save them. Since God was their official king, their safety and their national security was a consistent act of faith. But sometime around 1050 BCE, the various tribal leaders were getting uncomfortable with this arrangement. So they came to their current informal leader, this guy we talked about before, a man named Samuel, who's a prophet, and they had the succession plan conversation, the we can't afford you anymore conversation, the you're overqualified for this job conversation, and they forced him into retirement. See, what they said they wanted was not just another influential person like Samuel, they wanted a permanent position of leadership, like all the other countries around them had. These other countries, they led campaigns and conquests and defended their borders rigorously. They seemed powerful and aggressive and strong. They were patriotic and proud, and Israel wanted to be the same way, but Israel was different. They were weird. It was tenuously bound together by a commitment to God, not a political ideology, and God liked that, but the people didn't. They wanted what everybody else had around them, magnetic forces pulling them in a different direction. God tells them a king's a bad idea. And he warns them what could happen if they gave a flawed human being all that power over them. They were supposed to be a catalyst of change in the world, not to conform what everybody else was doing. He says kings make things complicated. Kings bring unintended consequences. But as we tend to do, and we still do today, they looked for political solutions to spiritual problems. They followed their political parties over their personable God. You can imagine the room, right? Like all these tribal leaders are together. They're kind of all posturing and angling, kind of looking for that nomination themselves. And so God does something unexpected. He does something that, based on what we just talked about, probably seems a little surprising and confusing to you. He points to this guy named Saul. And when we meet this guy, there's nothing about him that suggests he'd be a good king. The stories we can read about show that he's uninformed, he's indecisive, he's something of a coward, and honestly, he's kind of dumb sometimes. But he has everything that humans tend to look for in a king. One, his father is super rich. And two, it says that Saul was the most handsome man in Israel, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. Translation, he was smoking hot. He was tall, dark, and ripped. He had the Rock's body with Jimmy Garoppolo's head. He was like a soap opera actor. Who cares if he can perform, if he can look like that on the screen? He had everything people were looking for in a leader outwardly, resources, presence, and the uniform fit pretty nicely too, but just about nothing else. See, this is the kind of person they would have chosen. Yet what does God look for? Does this guy think like God? Does he hope like God? Does he want the same things that God wants? We don't know yet. If you read this story, and I think a lot of people assume this, it's easy to think that Saul was set up for failure, that maybe because God didn't want them to have a king, he gave them one like they would want to kind of teach him a lesson, to prove his point that it was a bad idea. But I don't think that's what's happening here. And I don't think the story suggests that. If you spend the rest of your week kind of reading through the story of Saul, especially in the beginning of 1 Samuel, which I encourage you to do, honestly, you're going to walk away with a lot more questions than answers. That's going to happen, but that's okay. I still think it's worth your time, and you should definitely check it out. But I think what we see in this story is that God gave Saul every opportunity possible. He wanted him to succeed. God wanted to be with him, to walk with him, to try to guide his heart in the right direction. I think God wanted to make the point that no one's heart is completely calibrated even when they're given a position of power. And he hoped that with careful attention that he could be the magnetic enough to turn Saul's heart in his direction. He was hoping Saul's inexperience and incompetence would actually drive his heart to God as it could for anyone in power. I heard from the chaplain of a president from a few administrations ago that this is exactly what happened to this guy. The president got into power, and he claimed he was a Christian, as you're supposed to do when you run for president, apparently, in America. He claims he was a Christian, but it wasn't really until he was in office that the weight of the office dropped him to his knees, and he really started to look to God for wisdom and advice and for help in the midst of this impossible Rubik's Cube that he was always dealing with. Power and his newly realized incompetencies drew him to God. But Saul knew he wasn't qualified. I mean, he even goes along, and at his own inauguration, he hides in the coat room. By the way, I mean, what a king, right? By the way, Do you know that no matter what position of power or influence God might choose you for, even when you're unqualified, especially when you're unqualified, even when you're hyperventilating at your own inauguration as people are announcing your name, God still thinks you're qualified enough. But soon after this kind of rocky start that Saul gets, King Saul begins to look like the king that they hoped he would be. So this is what happens. This gang called the Ammonites, they began to threaten an Israelite village called Jabesh Gilead. And they start to intimidate and besiege this town completely unprovoked. And then they offer a treaty. They say, hey, we'll stop beating up on you if you just do one thing for us. Have all the guys come out here, and we're going to gouge out their right eye. No big deal. We'll just, it'll be easy. See, they wanted to demoralize them. They wanted to show them who the real boss was, to insist on their power over them. A reminder for the rest of their lives that at that moment, at least, that those people had been powerless. This was a brutal era in human history, and I love the way that the Bible takes these things seriously. It doesn't try to sugarcoat it. It just shows you what really happened. The story says, the Spirit of God rushed upon Saul when he heard these words, and his anger was greatly kindled. His sense of justice flared up. His mind and desires snapped into place with God's, who hates oppression and intimidation and mutilation. And then in this disgusting rated R mafia-like moment, he sends a message to all of Israel. You can read about it later. All of Israel, inviting them to come to the defense of Jabesh Gilead, and they came out in droves and easily defended the city. See, the Spirit of God, it's a reoccurring theme in the leadership of Israel, especially in the early years. Before there was a formal position of leadership, the ability to rally people together from all over Israel was a sign that God was with someone. As one commentator put it, in a tribal society with no centralized government, it was difficult to get other tribes to stand with one or two that might be facing problems. The measure of a leader in such situation was his ability to compel others to follow, though he had no office of command over them. In Israel, this was a mark of the power of Yahweh, another name for God. For it was he alone who had the authority to call out the armies of the tribes. Can you imagine what it would take to galvanize our own political parties today under one cause? Other than daylight savings time. We're figuring that out. But it would take a miracle to get them on the same page, right? Now multiply that by 6. They thought if anyone can unify us in any way, the only explanation must be that God is with them. Before they had the king, this is how it always worked. That is, their leadership was based only on a person's influence, not on their position. A leader was worthy of leading if they could exert this kind of unifying, galvanizing, effective influence. So their old system of leadership was based on one of the most important truths about power. Cultivated influence is way more powerful than positional authority. Real leaders don't need a position. They just need the ability to galvanize people. God didn't want a king to get in the way of this kind of litmus test for his people. It's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking that you need the title, you need the endorsement to make a difference. But real leadership doesn't worry about positions, it worries about influence. Position can help you cultivate influence. It should say that it's somebody worth following. It should give you the resources you need to make your projects go further, faster. But it doesn't give you what you need the most: buy-in and trust and relationship and partners, people. I love the kind of rebel mentality that comes from all people. Jim Collins, he's kind of a classic business guru. You've maybe heard of him before, probably read his book, Good to Great. He's the kind of part of the establishment, and yet this is what he writes about real leadership. He says, for many people, the first question that occurs is, how do I persuade my CEO to get it? My answer? Don't worry about that. Each of us can create a pocket of greatness where you already are. Each of us can take our own area of work and influence and can concentrate on moving it from good to great. It doesn't really matter whether all the CEOs get it. It only matters that you and I and all the other people we influence do. Jim says, stop waiting for power. Stop wasting your energy complaining and criticizing the things you want to change. Do something with the power you already have. Most of us keep falling into this trap that it's position that gives us power, that we're helpless to the problems of the world, to the issues that get us worked up, that we can't help the poor and marginalized unless our church tells us how to, that we can't try a new approach with our clients unless our boss approves of it, that we can't do anything to help the Ukrainians right now, that's our government's job. They need to tell us what to do. If you actually want to make a difference, stop focusing on the position you don't have and start leveraging the influence you already do. My friend Melissa Adamson, she used to be part of the daunting, exhausting social work world. She worked daily with kids who need love and families who desperately wanted to give love, but they were stuck in these endless cycles, hoops and hurdles that slow down the progress of things like adoption. When we got into this new building, she said really early on that she wanted to use it as a place for a matching event that brings adoptable kids together with adopting families so they can meet and consider that relationship. Maybe you saw that Mark Wahlberg movie a few years ago, Instant Family, that kind of showcases this sort of thing. Great movie, highly recommend it. She told us, and she asked if we'd be interested. And then she worked with our scheduling. She met with Lisa and Matt and me. She contacted agencies she knew. She looped in other super passionate people here at our church that she knew would help get things done. And it's going to happen. It's coming up in October 8th, and we need some more help. And we're no sign-ups or anything yet, but just so you know, mark that down. It's a discovery thing, but it's not like a discovery staff thing. It's a discovery church thing. It's people in this church rallying together to fight against evil in our world that manifests itself as rejection and loneliness and red tape. Leveraging influence doesn't mean you disrespect authority or those in positions of power. It means just the opposite. Melissa knew we could say no, and she could still use her influence to make it happen somewhere else. But she also knew that because we knew her and we trusted her and we knew her heart and her heart was pointed towards God's heart, this is a slam dunk idea. It was just a matter of logistics. Clay Scroggins writes in one of the best books on leadership I've ever read. He says, influence has always been and will always be the currency of leadership. And the Harvard Business Review agrees. In an article called The Key to Change is Middle Management, a guy named Benem Tabrizi, let me say that again. Benem Tabrizi, anyway. He writes about his findings when it comes to organizational change, and most of the real power for effective, meaningful change sits with people in the middle, not at the top. He writes, a hallmark of the successful was the involvement of mid-level managers, 2 or more levels below the CEO. In those cases, mid-level managers weren't merely managing incremental change. They were leading it by working levers of power up and across and down in their organizations. What if the most powerful position you can hold in your organization or your church or your school district isn't at the top? It's actually not. What if it's where you already are? Because that's where the best place to cultivate influence is, in the middle. And influence is the thing that actually gets things done. So how do we cultivate real, effective influence? There are millions of leadership books making a lot of money trying to give you some answers to that. And I'm sure they do a great job with it, some good advice. And you should definitely check those out. But this story, which has survived and influenced the world for 3,000 years, says the best way is with God's help. Spirit of God rushing upon you. And the Spirit comes when your heart is aligned with God's heart. A compass pointed in the same direction. Your mission is the same as His mission. It comes from Him making you into someone worth following, and it comes from the condition of your heart. Now listen, the hard reality we all know is that influence can also come from other things other than a heart aligned with God. What do humans look at? Appearances, other things, other qualities that God doesn't. So sometimes people follow people for all the wrong reasons. That's what's so dangerous about positional authority. It oftentimes persists regardless of the health of a person's heart. For example, Ukraine is being ravaged right now by a misaligned heart whose positional power has given him the ability to murder people. This isn't the only way to gain influence and power, but history has shown lasting, meaningful influence comes from character and trust and relationships that's built on God's influence. It occurred to me during the pandemic when our economy was fragile and everybody was kind of afraid of what's going to happen to their jobs and everything that's going to happen to our nation. That the most important resource, the most valuable resource each of us have is not our competency, but it's our integrity. There will always be somebody that can do your job better than you. There will never be enough people of good character. There will always be someone who can fill your position. There will never be enough people of real influence. And so my advice, and I think God's advice, is if we want to stand out at work, focus more on your heart than on your performance. I thought Clay Scroggins' book, which is titled How to Lead When You're Not in Charge, was for somebody like me who's not a lead pastor or a CEO or an entrepreneur. But with great insight, he makes the point that this is actually for everybody because no one is ever really in charge. When you reach the tippy top of what you inevitably will realize, you are still accountable to somebody, whether it's voters or shareholders or investors or even the people that are working for you. Oh, and by the way, most of us here also believe you're accountable to Jesus when you get there too. So Scroggins writes that in that book, he says, influence always outpaces authority. And leaders who consistently leverage their authority to lead are far less effective in the long term than leaders who leverage their influence. Practice leading through influence when you're not in charge. It's the key to leading well when you actually are. So if you pursue influence, relationship-based, respect-based power rather than position, you'll have power no matter where you are in society. So the way we lead when we're not in charge is the same way we're going to lead when we finally are in charge. Those whose power come through influence, they don't care about their position. Position is just part of the appearances that distracts most people for short term. Influence comes from the heart, which God is looking at all of the time. I wish Saul would have known this. At first, he leverages his influence that God has given him, and he gets a little bit of success. But then he begins to leverage his position that people demanded of him. He begins to realize how fragile that kind of leadership is. Positional leadership demands results. It demands justification. Why are you here? Do you deserve to be here? If you trust influence, you have a network to fall back on when everything goes wrong. If you trust position, you have to protect it, and you better not let anybody threaten it. It's interesting, in the coming episodes, Saul consistently has all these other people like his general Abner or his son Jonathan or his spiritual advisor Samuel. They succeed and they make him look really, really good. And he could have seen this as an opportunity to celebrate the influence of all of the incredible people around them. And as their influence expands, his influence expands. But instead, he consistently clamors for credit to enhance his own reputation. For example, look at 1 Samuel 13. It says that Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba. And all Israel heard it said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines. Do you see that? Jonathan defeated the garrison, but that's not what everybody else heard. His own son is successful, but the credit goes to him. What if that success goes to Jonathan's head? What if he cultivates influence and then they want him in my position sooner rather than later? Saul squanders his influence with his own son to protect his position in front of the people. I wouldn't think much of this little detail, but the fact is that this becomes a repeated trend in his life, in his reign. This week in Core52, it recommends a book about Saul and two other kings called A Tale of Three Kings. It's this kind of novelized version of this story and a few others after it. In it, this old man, he talks about the nature of power to a younger man. This is what he says. Men, and of course women, men and women who speak endlessly on authority only prove they have none. And kings who make speeches about submission only betray twin fears in their hearts. They are not certain they are truly leaders, sent of God, and they live in mortal fear of rebellion. On the other hand, he goes on, no, authority from God is not afraid of challenges, makes no defenses, it doesn't get defensive, and it cares not one whit or one bit if it must be dethroned. That was the greatness of the great. How truly powerful must you be if you're not worried about losing your position? Or about getting voted out, watching another leader get promoted instead of you? How truly strong must you be if you're not worried about being perceived as weak? A leader with real power through influence isn't begging people to follow them because they're too busy knowing exactly which direction they're going. They're too focused on looking where God's heart is pointing, and they know they can still have power through influence even without a formal position. But in an effort to hold on to his position and grab more power for himself, Saul rips spiritual leadership out of the hands of his spiritual advisor, Samuel, and takes it as his own. He blatantly disobeys God so he can keep conquest trophies for his people. He gets distracted from his duties as he goes to set up a monument for himself. When he can't take credit for others' success, he plots to kill them to get them out of the way. So we see in Saul that power, especially the kind that leans on positional influence or positional power rather than influence, power amplifies our character. It exaggerates our strengths and weaknesses. It's like a bright light that shines through the cracks of our hearts. If our heart is strong and in line with God, then our influence is probably going to expand. But if our heart has blind spots and deficiencies, power stretches those cracks into crevices. To get ready for the new Lord of the Rings show that's coming out pretty soon, because I'm a super big nerd, I've been reading some of Tolkien's other writings, and in it I ran across this great description of the rings, the one ring and all the other rings and what they stand for, what they're meant to mean. And he says in this that power is a main theme throughout his work. Power is an ominous and sinister word in all of these tales. So the rings of power, when they're put on the person, they enhance the natural power of their possessor, thus approaching a kind of magic, which is then a motive easily corruptible into evil and a lust for domination. When they get the power, they're tempted by it. That is, their power enhances the nature and character of the one wielding it, and most are tempted by that power unless, he says, their character is sufficiently noble and heroic enough to resist that temptation, unless their hearts are right. This is what God wanted or warned them about in establishing an official positional king. Influence would no longer be the litmus test of God's endorsement. They no longer needed to rely on God's leadership through his spirit. The position would feed the leaders power no matter how corrupt they got. Saul's story is warning that we need to be like God and focus on our character rather than our positions of power. Lasting power starts with a well-developed heart that will know what to do with power before they get it. Because of Saul's lies, his disobedience, his selfishness, God doesn't immediately remove him from his position, but he starts to build kingly influence in someone else. And this is how he breaks the news to the prophet Samuel. He says, "Then the Lord said to Samuel, I'm sorry that I ever made Saul king, for he has not been loyal to me and he has refused to obey my commands." Samuel was so deeply moved when he heard this that he cried out to the Lord all night. This was a heartbreaking moment for all of them. God believed in Saul. Samuel believed in Saul. And they gave him every opportunity, but at some point, Saul forgot who the real king was. He forgot to line his heart up with God's heart. He neglected his character and thus lost his influence and thus lost his real power. Samuel delivers the news to Saul, and surprise, surprise, Saul goes on to place blame on the people who are supposed to be following him. He makes excuses. He says he didn't know. By the way, blame, excuses, ignorance, they're all the fast track to losing all of your influence with the people you're supposed to be leading. In the midst of it, Samuel makes this heartbreaking statement. He says, although you think little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord God has anointed you king of Israel. God thought the world of him, but Saul couldn't get out of his own inner world. God saw all his strengths and potential, but Saul was fixated on every bit of his weakness, and the cumulative effect was an insecure, fearful, disobedient man worried more about how he appeared before the people rather than what God thought of him. His self-obsession, as it always is, was his downfall. So in a pitiful plea, last-ditch effort to save face, he begs Samuel to help him keep up appearances. Then Saul pleaded again, I know I've sinned, but please, at least honor me before the elders of the people, before Israel, by coming back with me, so that I may worship the Lord your God. He's worried about his appearances, not his heart. And look at that shift in verbiage. It's not his God, it's Samuel's God now. He doesn't care about his heart anymore. He only cares about his reputation. He's chosen his temporary positional power over the eternal source of power in the universe. And that brings us to the last truth about power. You already have more power than you realize. Throughout this story, we see God change his mind a couple times. Or at least that's what it says. God acts based on how we ask and how we act. The people ask for a king and God gives it to him. God is patient with Saul. He helps him cultivate influence. Even when he's incompetent, he tries to help, and then God regrets that he made Saul king. He goes a different direction. With human input, God changes course. People jump through all kinds of theological hoops to explain how God relates to the future and foreknowledge in his plan. And we know God is actively and competently, he's bringing about his eternal goals. He is beyond capable of accomplishing all of his purposes. But what this story and so many other stories in the Bible are trying to tell you is that you can influence God. That the way you pray, the way you align your mind, the way you train your desires, the desires of your heart, the way you respond to him will affect your eternal, all-powerful King of the universe. He's listening to you. He's waiting for you. He's watching for what you'll do next. And even in our imperfect, incompetent attempts to do what he wants to come alongside you and assist you. Who needs position and power when you have him? Or do you think so little of yourself that you won't respond to this invitation to power from the God of the universe? When Tabrizi studied the power of middle management, we talked about before, in leading change, he tried to piece together the factors that made all the difference, and it all came back to him, to what he called a North Star. These change agents seem to be guided by something much bigger than themselves. They are pointed in a clear sense of direction. Obviously, this wasn't always God in these cases, but if he becomes our North Star, our true north, the thing that our compass is aligning with, how much more effective can that be for you and for me if we have a clear, true north, a North Star in the midst of our attempts at power, even when we find ourselves at the bottom of the totem pole? Saul wasn't just the leader of Israel. He could have been like the vice president of the galaxy right under God. And God wants to invite you into a role like that too. A role where you can bend the ear of the king. You can change his direction. He can change yours. That is, if your hearts are aligned together, you have all of the infinite resources and influence available. You have all the power you'll ever need. You don't need to have a seat at the table because you already do. And once you start taking advantage of your existing power and authority through God, letting him have your mind, have your desires, have your purpose, no room on this planet will be too big for you. No seat at the table will be too intimidating. No position will be so distracting that it gets you off course from your North Star. There will still be hard decisions to make, and you're still going to make mistakes. You're going to experience disappointment. You're going to mourn failures, and there will be other broken people abusing their positions of power. But you'll be able to be resilient through it all because no matter where it leads you, you know that God's not looking at the things that everybody else is looking at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord is looking at your heart. So the challenge this week as you continue to read is to sit down with a mentor, to have lunch, to have coffee, somebody you look up to, somebody who has influence over your life, somebody who seems to have their heart aligned with God's heart, being pulled in that direction, and start to ask them, where do you see my heart pointing? Where do you see the magnetic forces in my world? And I'd encourage you before the end of the day today to get something on the books, to send that text, to send that email, to try to get an opportunity to sit down with somebody and listen humbly, like Saul should have listened to Samuel, like Saul should have listened to God, like Saul should have listened to all the other people that were people in his spheres of influence, and see which way your heart is pointing. But for right now, we're going to take a few minutes, as we do every single week. It's a moment for us to bend the ear of the King of the universe. We come into his presence the way that he taught us to. We literally, almost literally, we take a seat at his table, and throughout the room we have 4 tables that are set with a small meal, a little bit of bread, a little bit of juice that remind us that the God of the universe came in flesh and bone. He never held a position of power. And yet he had the most influence over history that we've ever seen or could even imagine. He's changed everything with no formal titles, no authority, no positions. Because he was a man of influence, because his heart was completely, perfectly calibrated in the direction that God was calling him. And so we take a little bit of bread, a little bit of juice, and we ask him as that goes into our bodies that his life and his death, his resurrection will be inside of us, and it will start to work on our hearts to make us people after God's own heart, something that God looks at and is so proud and so ready to continue to work with us as we seek to follow him in our everyday lives. But as you come and you receive that grace, and you receive that promise that the King of the universe, the all-powerful one, the power himself will be with you, we also want to encourage you to take some time to think through how you're going to leverage the power you already have to benefit other people. Maybe it's your time, it's your attention. Maybe it's through your financial resources, and you want to give to Discovery in some way to empower the mission that we have here, and we'd love for you to consider to do that. You can do that at the boxes at the tables. You can do that online as well. This is a moment to connect with the God of the universe, to both give and to receive as we continue to worship and we set our hearts and minds and our attention on him, hoping that that magnetic force of his presence will pull us in the right direction. Let's pray. God, we're so grateful for the opportunity to come in front of you, to have a seat at your table. We take that for granted all the time. That we don't need to worry about these other positions of power in these places. Those will come. Those we'll eventually get influence in the right places if we seek influence in the most important places. God, I pray that you be with us as we look at our hearts, as we see them as a compass, as kind of a mind, and we understand the way that we think, the way that we hope, the way that we desire, the way that we love will be, that those things are going to affect the direction of our lives. And we ask that you'll shape us and pull us, become a powerful magnetic force in our lives that pulls us in the right direction. And God, we know we can do that by singing. We know that we can do that by taking communion. We know that we can do that by taking these next few moments seriously, practicing our attention on you, practicing the ability of directing our heart by focusing everything we have on your presence right now. We love you, God, and we thank you for this day. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Darkness tries to roll over my bones, and sorrow comes to steal joy I own. Brokenness and pain is all I know. I won't be shaken. I won't be shaken. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. Sin no longer has a place to hide. I am not a captive to vice. I'm not afraid to leave my past behind. I won't be shaken. I won't be shaken. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. This power that can break off every chain. This power that can empty out a grave. This resurrection power that can save. This power in your name. Power in your name. This power that can break off every chain. This power that can empty out a grave. This resurrection power that can save. This power in your name. Power in your name. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your
Amen. Discovery, love you. Thank you for worshiping with us. If you're new, we would love to meet you. We have base camp in our public room right after this service. It's an awesome time for you to meet us, for us to meet you. We love to see you. Have a great week.